So take a look at what you're wearing for me. I bet you that chances are you'll find at least some of the items you've got on are made up of mixed fabrics, right? So like a cotton-polyester blend, something like that. But did you know that there's actually laws in the Bible which legislate against that? But according to places like Leviticus and Deuteronomy, the wearing of mixed fabrics is prohibited. So a question which often gets asked is, well, what are we supposed to do with that? Are these Old Testament laws relevant to us as Christians today? And the answer is, well, both yes and no. You see, there's a few different aspects to the laws that we find in places like Leviticus. And firstly, there's what we might call a civic or a civil aspect, but also there's what we might call a moral aspect. And so let me just try and explain what that all means. Now, did you know that in New Zealand, there's a law that says you can't fly in a hot air balloon whilst carrying a rooster? It's a bit disappointing, I know. But the question is, well, am I bound to obey that law? Well, no, I'm not, because I don't live in New Zealand. And so I'm not under the laws of the nation of New Zealand. And the same is true for us when we read something like Leviticus. The laws that we find there are not the laws of the United Kingdom, for example. They are the laws of ancient Israel. And unless you're listening to this thousands of years ago in ancient Israel, then those laws are not directly applicable to you. But then we might ask ourselves, well, why bother with them at all then? Why do we have books like Leviticus and Deuteronomy in the Bible in the first place? What's the point? And you see, that's where we get to the second part. Even though these laws in their civic aspect might not be relevant because they were written to a different group of people in a different time, in a different context, there's still a moral aspect to these laws that is relevant for us today. Now, after all, these laws were given by God, a God who is unchanging, the same yesterday, today, and forever. And as Christians, we believe that if God said something, even 3,000 years ago, if he said it, then it's still true. That God doesn't just change his mind. And so let's take an example. One of those laws in Leviticus says that if you steal your neighbour's property, you have to give it back plus pay an extra 20%. Now, when we read a verse like that, at first glance, it's not directly relevant to us, is it? Because we live in a different country, we have different rules around stealing. We have different punishments for it. But there's still a moral principle there, isn't there? There's still something that we can take away from that. We can learn that God dislikes stealing. That stealing is wrong according to the creator of heaven and earth. And because God is unchanging, we can assume that that moral principle remains the same, that God hasn't just changed his mind about that. And so even if the civic application of that law, the specific way that it is dealt with, isn't relevant to us today in a different nation, under different circumstances, that moral principle remains the same. And actually, I think we can take this way of reading the Old Testament laws and use them for all of them. All we have to do is ask the question, well, what is the principle behind this law that I'm supposed to learn from? Some of the laws, it might be more difficult to do that with than others. Some of them might take a little bit of background knowledge on our behalf. Some of them we might need to do a little bit of digging, a little bit of research to try and discover what that moral principle is. But it is possible. It is there. And so even if that civic application differs in our day and in our context, that moral principle is still something that we can learn from. And it's still something that is relevant to us as Christians. And so I hope that's helpful. I hope that's answered a few questions. Now, perhaps with that in mind, I'm off to find a rooster and rent a hot air balloon. And I'm going to go enjoy the fact that I don't live in New Zealand. So thanks and God bless. Until next time. Bye-bye.